Hello and welcome to the Tough Girl podcast, which is all about motivating and inspiring you. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. The Tough Girl podcast is sponsored and ad-free thanks to the monthly financial support of patrons. To find out more about supporting your favourite podcast and becoming a patron, please check out Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl podcast and help me to increase the amount of female role models in the media. All patrons will get their name on a dedicated patrons page on the Tough Girl website. All female patrons $5 and above are invited to join the closed Facebook group, the Tough Girl Tribe. Today, I'm delighted we're going to be speaking to Sophia Danenberg, who in 2006 became the first African-American and first Black woman from anywhere in the world to climb the highest mountain, Mount Everest in the Himalayas. During this episode, Sophia shares more about her passion for mountaineering and how her passion for climbing evolved. Sophia talks about her Everest experience and what it was like on the mountain for summit day. She also shares advice and top tips to help you achieve your goals. Sophia starts us off by sharing more about her childhood and what her life was like growing up.
So I had a really unusual childhood. I'm half Japanese. I was born in Okinawa. And even though I came back to the US when I was when I was a baby, I did go back to Japan as a toddler. And so I grew up between the US and a little bit in Japan. I have one older sister, and then I have two younger half siblings that I didn't grow up with who are Japanese. It's funny to say, we were living in Okinawa, and so we weren't outdoorsy in the sense of, doing sports, but certainly we were outside all the time. My family were sugarcane farmers, and so we were always in the fields and running around playing. And also it was very unusual. We didn't have indoor plumbing. And so when I would say we were outside a lot. We had a very small house that was shared with a really large family. And then when I moved to the US, it was almost the opposite. We moved to a suburb of Chicago in the middle of the winter. So it was really cold. And same, our family, I played a lot outside. I'd bike around the neighborhood and, go to the, fields and the trees and climb the trees. But same, I didn't really do outdoor sports as most people think of it.
Do you speak Japanese?
Poorly. But yes, I speak a little bit.
How old were you when you moved over to America?
I moved over permanently when I was 6. So in first grade.
That must have been, I suppose, I struggle to try and actually remember my childhood. And I can't really sort of recall that much of it. But I can't imagine that must have been such a shock to the system to move from Japan over to America. Do you remember much of that time?
I do. I mean, I really remember being in Japan, but it's little bits and stories. Like I can remember where I lived and, where I went to school. And then, the things that you remember, like getting in trouble. Like I can remember, my sister and I getting in trouble one time playing behind the school and falling into some muddy ditch or something like that. And I can really remember coming back. I can remember leaving Japan and arriving in the US. At the time, I actually didn't speak English very well. And so my memories are just not kind of following everything that was happening around me, that there were all of these things, but I didn't really speak the language that everyone was speaking to me. And of course, I look like I should speak English. So when I come to the US, nobody expects me to speak Japanese. And so everyone was speaking English to me, and I don't think I understood anyone. And so my sister would translate for me because she was really fluent in both, because she was a little bit older and had learned a bit more English in school. Whereas I had only, been in school for, really 1 year where they were teaching me English. And so I didn't really speak it well at all.
Yeah. Have you been back to visit Japan? Is that something that you've done?
Yes, actually, I went back to Japan after college on a Fulbright fellowship. And I'd also visited when I was in high school, but mainly I lived there for 4 years after college. And then I was there for, 6 months. I'd taken a sabbatical during college and gone there, as well as a visit in high school. So I've been there quite a bit. Most of the Japanese, I forgot my Japanese when I was in the US and learning English. So that little bit of Japanese that I do know is mostly from going back after college and living there. I think the only thing I got is that people say that I speak very naturally and very quickly, unusually quickly for somebody who's not fluent.
Let's talk about the mountains. When did you start getting into mountaineering?
It's all sort of creep, and it always depends on what you consider to be mountaineering. My family didn't do any backpacking or, hiking, camping, nothing like that. So the first time I did any of that was one trip right before I started college. But I wouldn't say I really was getting into it. The time that really started and that I would say stuck was actually right before I left Japan. My best friend from high school was living in New Hampshire, and she was a big rock climber and snowboarder and mountaineer. And so when I visited her over one winter, she had, taken me to do a few of these things, cross country skiing and snowboarding and hiking, and really insisted that I needed to rock climb. And so I took a rock climbing lesson in Japan. I had recalled going into a Patagonia store near where I lived, and there was one of those flyers pegged on the wall that said they had rock climbing lessons. And so I signed up. There's a very tall guy named Jack who was teaching the lessons, and I really loved it. And so I moved back to the US soon after that, and being in a new place and not knowing anybody and looking for things to do, sort of one of the first things I went to do living in Connecticut was to go rock climbing.
Did you manage to make sort of quite a lot of new friends that way?
Yes. But when I moved to Connecticut, almost all of my first friends were rock climbers. It's funny in that way, right? I knew people from work, and I knew people who were friends of friends, and then I knew rock climbers, and that was almost everybody.
Did you ever have ambitions or desires to climb the highest mountains in the world? Was that ever on your radar?
No, I hadn't even really thought about it. Even as I was, starting with that hiking and rock climbing, I don't think these mountains were even in I don't know, they weren't in my sphere. It's not even like I was watching television shows or reading about them. I didn't even think about these mountains. I didn't think about small mountains like Mount Rainier, nevertheless, bigger mountains. So no, not at all.
Yeah. So you have climbed Everest, but I know that it wasn't sort of a straight going to climb Everest, that was the dream. It sort of happened in a roundabout way. So do you want to share sort of the story behind that, and then how you ended up to becoming to go and climb Everest?
Yeah, it's funny. People ask me how I got there, and I just say, creep. I was, rock climbing, and in Connecticut at the time there's sort of a style of rock climbing that everybody does called traditional climbing. So it's not, not a lot of people at the time climbed inside, and they didn't climb sports, so that they weren't like you know they were having to place their own gear. And so that's how I learned to rock climb. And I think when you learn that way, and then in the winters, a lot of people ice climbed. And so going from sort of traditional rock climbing to ice climbing to mountaineering is a fairly natural path. I think because I didn't start indoors, I didn't have that sort of big jump. I think people who start rock climbing indoors will become really proficient technical rock climbers, and then going outside feels very daunting. But because I learned to rock climb outside, I learned everything outside. And in fact, I didn't climb in a gym until I'd been rock climbing outside for quite a long time. And I hadn't sport climbed until I had been rock climbing for, oh goodness, probably 5 years or 6 years. So, there is this sort of way where as I said, as you're sort of progressing through these, where it does seem like a natural progression. I had that same friend, the one who was living in New Hampshire, had also wanted to always climb Mount Rainier. And again, I hadn't really thought about it. I vaguely remember hearing some people saying that they were going to climb these mountains, in this area where I live now, but I was on the other side of the country. But again, I'd never considered it, and until she suggested it. And so I was like, sure, let's do that. I didn't really know what Mount Rainier was. I hadn't really heard about it. I sort of started reading up about it after I agreed to climb it. But the two of us trained in New Hampshire. She had friends who were climbing guides and were willing to teach us all of the skills. And we just came out and we climbed two mountains, Mount Baker and Mount Rainier here in Washington State. That was, 2002, I guess. It was a long time ago. And from there, it was really quick. I think I just fell in love with it. And so at that point, like every vacation, every time I had off, I was mountaineering. So I just started going to other mountains, in this area. I went to South America, to Mexico, and then eventually to Nepal. That was all in a matter of 2 or 3 years from that Mount Rainier trip. So it was a pretty quick progression.
You said that you fell in love with the mountains. Was there a moment, or what is it about being in the mountains? If you could try and describe that feeling, or what it is that really sort of resonates with you.
Oh, I think there's just everything about it. At the time, it's the kind of the beauty, the quiet. There's a lot of solitude. Even climbing Mount Rainier, which is a really popular mountain, we climbed a route called Emmons Winthrop, which is much less popular. So we didn't see a lot of the crowds that you might see on the more popular mountains. Plus, none of these mountains were as crowded, 20 years ago as they are now. And so there was a lot of just being able to get yourself to these places that, no one else was there. And just seeing these really just beautiful moments, not necessarily like they would just pop in, the way the clouds would roll over at certain moments, or seeing a sunrise as you're climbing. Not necessarily just the summit, and a lot of times not the summit. In fact, a lot of the beauty was sort of on the route, and the summit was just something you were kind of, doing because that's what you're supposed to do. But I really think I love the process of climbing.
So, like climbing Mount Rainier and Mount Baker in 2002, and then 2006, you were climbing Everest. So, this four-year time period before you summited the highest mountain in the world. What was the most challenging aspect of that time period?
Oh, there was a lot, I suppose. I a lot of it, there was a lot, and then in a lot of ways there wasn't, right? Because I wasn't really pursuing anything. I was fairly free to fail, to just, not climb things, to give up. And so I went to a lot of mountains that I didn't summit. I guess I don't really think of them as challenging, because it's sort of like a lot of times it was just weather, and almost every time, in fact, it was weather. I'm not sure if I ever attempted a mountain that I would have felt like I wasn't capable of climbing had the conditions worked out. And weather is just weather. You can't do anything about it. I was sort of progressing to more difficult, more technical mountains. Probably one of the most disappointing was Denali. That was, there's a route there, West Rib, that I really wanted to climb, and it was in terrible condition that season. And so we didn't even really get that far up the mountain. But then we decided to go up a different route, and it was really miserable. It's way too long a story, but it was just a very sort of unpleasant experience. And so it's a mountain that it was sort of sad. I think I had been having so much fun and having such a great time, and to have such a sort of terrible time on a mountain, that was very disappointing. And not from like a physical aspect, or like just having to do with sort of the whole, all of the sort of conditions around it. Not really. As I said, it's the climbing was fine, the being on the mountain was fine, but everything else was sort of miserable. So, and I felt okay, but it was a pretty miserable experience overall.
Yeah. So originally you were planning to go and climb, I'm going to hopefully say this right, Choyoyu.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was post-monsoon season, so basically Choyoyu wasn't really a good option. So do you just want to share, what happened when they suggested, well, why don't you climb Everest instead?
Yes, well, actually, Choyu is normally climbed post-monsoon. So I had planned that year to take the time off work and climb in the post-monsoon season. But then there was a guiding company that was offering a climb with, I want to say his name is Tashi Tenzing, but he's Tenzing Norgay's grandson, I believe, was guiding. And I thought, well, that might be cool to go with him. But I wanted to just talk to the people the other company that I had planned on climbing post monsoon with. The climb with Tashi Tenzing was pre monsoon. And so I called the company and said, "Oh, hey, I'm thinking about, doing this pre-monsoon. So it's a little early. It was January, but I want to talk to you about this climb that you're doing in October." And, they asked sort of the normal questions about what you've climbed before and, who did you climb with? And usually, in almost every case, I was climbing independently or on my own. I'd only sort of hired guides a couple of times. So I told them about what I climbed and my experience. And I think there was a little giveaway, which was that I was considering doing this Choyu climb pre-monsoon, right, which is when Everest is normally climbed, which probably told them that I had the ability to take time off from work at that time. And so they were like, well, listening to your experience and everything you've done, Eric Simonson, who's sort of the owner of IMG, said, I think that you'd be a good candidate for Everest. Even if you don't make the summit, if you get to Camp 4, you're going to have a very similar experience as climbing Choyu. And then if you're at Camp 4, you have an opportunity to go for the summit of Everest if you're feeling good. But overall, it seems like you're a person who really isn't about the summit. You're more about the journey. You have done all of this climbing. You've been to high altitude before. Why don't you try Everest? And so that is really how I ended up there. It was January, and I had 2 months to get there, and I had about 2 weeks to decide whether or not I was going to go. And so I kind of hung up the phone and considered it for 2 weeks, and I signed up.
How did you process it? Like, how did you make that decision? Was it a gut instinct? Was it pros and cons? Did you speak to family members? Did you, how did you decide that actually, you were going to take on Everest?
Well, yes. I obviously I was married at the time. I'm divorced now, but I spoke to my ex-husband, obviously, and checked the bank account. Everest is a lot more expensive than Choyu. It's considerably more expensive. I had to sort of check around to see very quickly if I could take quite that much time off from work. It was a little bit more than I was planning, but it didn't actually make a difference because the way our leaves of absences worked, they were for 3 months, and so 3 months was sort of what people often did, and so 3 months was plenty of time for Everest. And really just trying to do a little research into what it would be like to go up the mountain. I was calling about guided climbs, fully guided climbs, even though I hadn't actually been climbing guided previously. It seemed like Everest was the type of mountain that you
I'll have a guide for Everest.
Yeah, but the climb that I was going on with IMG, the pre-monsoon climb, was actually supported but not guided. So I wasn't going to have a guide the same way that I was thinking on Choyu, and it was also like half the price, not quite half, maybe like 60% of the price that it would have been to have a guided climb. And so I did have to do a little bit of research into sort of the route and the weather conditions, and how do people do basic decision making on the mountain. But I think the fact that Eric thought I could do it gave me confidence that I could do it, or at least try it. And then most of it was just giving myself permission to fail. I think there was a lot that it was presented to me as, well, at least if you get to Camp 4, you'll have a similar experience. So a lot of what I think people think about, trying for the summit and that pressure of going for the summit, I didn't feel a lot of that. I was processing it more like just a regular climb. And if the Everest summit seemed like it was a good idea, then I would do it. And if not, I just wouldn't. So in that sense, I think it was a little bit easier decision.
Yeah. How did your friends and family react when you shared with them that you were going to go and climb Everest? And obviously explained, you'll see about getting to Camp 4 and see with the weather and, maybe go for the summit, maybe not. And what was their response?
Well, I learned after they're a lot more nervous than I realized. At the time I thought, well, everyone seems to be taking it in stride. There is a thing like, going to Everest, there's a lot of paperwork. And I think that the paperwork is very scary. It's not what, normally, people climb and you might have a few, you know, there's those sort of forms that people often sign without reading them. But, on Everest, it's quite different because you have to sign, there's a form called a body disposal form, which is literally what it's called. And it's a decision of saying, if you die on the mountain, what's going to happen with your body? Are they going to leave it on the mountain? Are they going to, bring it to base camp for a traditional ceremony? Do you want to be repatriated? Things like that. And if you decide that you want to be brought down and repatriated your body, then you actually need somebody to sign to say that they'll pay for all of that. And so you have to have very explicit conversations with people about so if I die, I'm thinking I'm just going to have my body left there, because once I sign this form, you're not going to really have that much of an option to change. That's what they're going to do. If you feel like, I'm going to be dead. So if you feel like you would like my body to come back, then you need to, sign on this form for however much it's going to cost. And it's not cheap, it could be $10,000, or, there's sort of these discussions you have to have. That's, I think, is not normal set of discussions at that age, especially. And I had decided, in fact, that I would want not to be repatriated, but just to be brought down, or, to either be not necessarily brought down, to be brought down if possible, if not to be basically my body to be disposed of on the mountain. What I didn't want was for it to sort of, have people to be sort of stepping over it for decades to come. And then my ex-husband was going to trek to Nepal, to the villages that have churtans. They have which are basically like monuments to people who've died on the mountain, and that he was going to build a churtan for me, and he was going to bring a piece of granite from Connecticut, which is quite something that he was going to trek up with, but he's very strong. He was going to bring a piece of granite from Connecticut that was going to be etched in my memory. And so it was a very detailed decision that I had to make about what I was going to do if I was going to die. And I don't think, mountaineers climbing most mountains in life ever have discussions like that, or really think about in that level of detail. So I think if it wasn't sort of real to everybody before, it was quite real to everybody then. But probably to me, I had confidence in my ability to quit, that barring some, unforeseen accident, that I would just stop, that I would not push it. And so maybe I was a little bit, feeling a little bit better about it than other people. In that sense, that I maybe wasn't as nervous. I got all of these voicemails. I was literally at the airport, flying out, and I realized I had 10 voicemails, and it was all family members calling me with sounding all very somber, wishing me luck, but all sounding extremely somber, and nervous, in these phone calls. And so that's when I realized how scared they all were.
How old were you?
Oh gosh, how old was I? 30 something. Let's see, what year was that? I'm old enough now that I have to do the math. I was 33, 34. What year was it?
Yeah.
Something like that.
It's really interesting, hearing that perspective, because I think sometimes Everest now is from what you read in the papers, if you've got the money, anyone can go and climb Everest. There's I'm sure you saw the picture, I don't know if it was in 2019 or 2018, of people queuing to get onto the mountain. And anyway, and sometimes it's almost like the risks don't really get talked about. People end up focusing on the achievement and the goal and the dreams and the ambition and, what it would mean. And almost sort of not wipe away, but sort of reduce down the risks of taking on some of these challenges. But it is a big mountain. People do die on it. When did reality set in for you? Were you ever scared? Did your fear ever sort of come to the surface?
I'm not sure if I was ever really scared because, again, I think I spent the whole time going every decision I was making was very incremental, right? And I was always sort of willing to quit. And so at every point, I knew that I had, really thought about all of everything that was going on, getting up, getting down, what was happening with the weather, and, could I push through it? And so I don't think that I ever was scared in that way. I think one thing to keep in mind, I think for me versus a lot of people who climb Everest, a lot of people who are like me who climb Everest who are just climbers who are climbing Everest. And then there are people who are climbing Everest, only climbing Everest, but they're not sort of otherwise climbers. In the years before I climbed Everest, when I said I spent every vacation, I wasn't spending every vacation training. I was spending all of my vacations doing my fun hobby that I loved, which was climbing every little random mountain that was around me. Unnotable mountains, mountains that nobody talks about, that nobody really cares that anybody climbs, because it was fun. And so I think for me, like there was no need to climb this mountain. And I wasn't sort of climbing Everest to climb Everest. So it was just another mountain that I was climbing. And these sort of decisions, this turning around and judging the conditions, I had been doing that for years on all of these mountains that I'd been climbing without a guide. I think that there are people who sign up to climb Everest and they might climb other mountains beforehand, but because their goal is to climb Everest, they're climbing those other mountains in the same style, maybe guided, where somebody else is making all those decisions. And they're really only climbing for training or climbing for preparation, right? They're just trying, they're climbing to work their way up to Everest, not sort of for the hobby of it. I think when you're climbing for the hobby of it, there's just a lot of little things you learn that you don't really think of as being sort of a big deal at the time. It helps in your decision making, and then it also helps in the confidence. It helps you sort of know what's happening in a lot of detail, because you weren't just sort of following somebody else up, like you were making that path on those other mountains. And so, I also wasn't following somebody up Everest. So but I could look at the terrain. I could look at, I could make those decisions. And so I could look at it and understand what was happening. I could understand, is this route good or bad? What does this look like? Is this normal? Is this not normal? I think as I said, I think it looked quite different to me in that way. And lots of other people, as I said, there's lots of people like that on Everest, but I think a lot of the people that you hear talking about Everest, speakers and blah, 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 there's more people who are out there talking about Everest who sort of lean to the people whose their purpose was to climb Everest, right? Because kind of being a motivational speaker and doing an accomplishment kind of go hand in hand, right? Versus like there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who've climbed Everest just as a mountain, like me, and they're just not out there talking about it because you don't climb mountains and then become a motivational speaker. It's just not a thing. I don't know how to describe it. So it wasn't your purpose to get publicity. It wasn't your purpose. It was just So I think that if you actually heard from all of the people who climbed Everest more evenly, it might sound different to people.
What was your summit night like, and what was it like once you reached the top?
So the summit night was interesting, and it was quite different. And I think a lot of my experience probably came into play and helped at that point. We went up and we had gotten a bad weather report, which happens. It's a little unfortunate. These weather reports are expensive. I think they're probably there's something like $100 per report per day, for every day that you get a weather forecast. So it's not like it's not like I'm going to AccuWeather or something. They're very specific mountain focused weather reports, but this one was wrong. And so, you start from Camp 2. At that point, you're basically going for the summit. So you're going up and down, up and down, up and down the mountains. And then at some point you decide you're going to sort of push forward. And really, once you push past Camp 2 to Camp 3, you're on your summit push. So I had gone up and this weather report was not right. So I was going to Camp 4 and the weather really turned badly. And it was supposed to hold off for a few days. We were actually trying to beat the system. And instead, it sort of ended up on us. And so I got to Camp 4 thinking that we weren't going to go to the summit, that we were just going to turn around and go down. So, I discussed it with Panudu and who I was climbing with, and we weren't going to go. The conditions were terrible. There are people who had gone out on the mountain the night before. And generally with Everest, you leave at about 9 p.m. with the goal of, with a turnaround time the next day. I think it varies. People's turnaround times are something like noon or 2 p.m. So very long, right? 16, 17 hours to get to the summit, and you turn around. And then to be back at Camp 4 before sunset the next day, basically, right? You leave at 9 p.m. and then you're trying to get back. So there were people at this point, it was quite late and people were still on the mountain and the storm was really bad. And they were looking like people who had left the night before were needing rescues. And, a lot of the Sherpas were sort of, going to help with the rescues. And so again, I sort of went to sleep thinking I'm just going to wake up in the morning and head down. But at about 11 p.m., so a couple hours after we were supposed to start, the weather had apparently been clearing while I was asleep and Panudu was awake. And so he just came knocking on our tent and said, let's do this. And I was staying in the tent with another person who he was with the same guiding company, but we weren't like climbing together. But, Panudu was like, I think we can go. I think we should do this. It's starting to clear. This looks like this is going to work. And we might have just a window to go. So threw on all of my stuff, really fast, really frantic, not at all what I had thought was going to be the way I was going to start up on my Everest summit and, headed out. And there were a bunch of people, probably a dozen people who had headed out ahead of us. And I headed out with that same guy. And we were slowly passing people as we were moving ahead. And we kind of lost him. He was climbing with a different Sherpa. And so Panu and I kind of lost him. And then at one point we had passed everybody. And in fact, we got to what appeared to be the first group of like 4 people. And we paused because there was this snowstorm, right? And so there was actually a lot of snow. And I don't know if you know what like breaking trail is, which is like it's the difference between like climbing on, like walking like on snow where somebody has already walked and created a path.
Yeah.
And if they haven't, if you're the first person, then you have to kind of create that path and it's a lot more work. So we had maybe hoped to hook up with that first group of people to go in a group and break trail together. And they basically said no. Basically, we're like, they basically like were hanging on the rope and they're like, you can pass us and go on your own, or you can sit here behind us and be stuck. Like, but we're not going to go with you. So we passed them and went ahead. I don't know. I guess they were thinking maybe they catch up with us or something, but we ended up breaking trail, which was unfortunate because at that point, then it was just 2 of us. And on Everest, you usually like you switch places breaking trail, like one person's in front and the one's in back. But there's also this thing where you're on the rope with the fixed line and you're dragging this thing called Jumar. And so it's actually kind of nice to be in the front because if you're in the front and you're dragging this thing on the rope and there's somebody behind you, they're like holding the rope, right? So that you have something when you're pulling this Jumar to be pulling against. But if you're in front, it meant you're breaking trail. So there was this choice between you could be in the back and like dragging your Jumar, which is really hard on your arms, or you could be in the front and breaking trail. And so we kind of just switched back and forth occasionally to sort of whatever, not great task. And then we got to a spot. It's kind of a typical rest spot. And it's where a lot of Sherpas come and they actually will leave oxygen for clients. We didn't actually, we were climbing we were climbing with smaller oxygen tanks. So we were climbing also in a very different style. We weren't climbing with those large oxygen tanks that other people were. Smaller tanks, less oxygen, with the philosophy that you can move a little faster because the tanks were lighter. But you had to be at sort of a lower, you couldn't be breathing as much oxygen as people with the bigger tanks. So we were there and we were sort of checking on the weather. At this point, we looked down and we couldn't see anybody. And we kind of thought everybody had maybe turned around. Because it was weird. Like people have headlamps. It's the middle of the night. And like, we couldn't see any headlamps. And we thought, oh gosh, are we like the only, and we knew like we had at least started with that one guy and there was like 12 people that we had passed. And so we really thought we were on our own. I mean, we were just there thinking, should we go down? And we messaged base camp and they said, oh, it looks like there's a storm. Maybe you should turn back. And so we really had a decision to make there, but really but we had climbed out of that storm. Like Panuno was right. Like we had, at that point where we were sitting, it was totally clear above us. And we could see the storm. We could see the kind of the clouds below us and little bits of lightning. But above us, it was just completely clear. There were no clouds at all. It was all the stars in the sky, that more stars than I will ever see the rest of my life. And we knew that we were clear. So we made the decision to keep going. In the time that we had stopped there, Panuru's brother actually had shown up and he was carrying oxygen to that spot for another client, a different guide team. And he had never been to the summit and he wanted to go and asked if he could come with us. And, I was like, yes, sure. Like, definitely 3 is definitely better than 2. Like, if you want to come, let's go. So the three of us went to the summit, and we got there in really good time. In fact, we got there just right, not long after sunset at about 7 a.m., which is perfect. So long before like the 2 p.m. turnaround time, which was great because we had also left 2 hours later than most people start. So we were making great time. And yeah, it was just sort of clear and beautiful and light flurries. And it was just us. So all of those stories that people tell about the crowds and the lines, like we didn't experience any of that. It was almost the opposite. And as it turns out, there were actually a bunch of people coming up, and they were all about 2 hours behind us, and that's why we didn't see them. I don't think we realized that we were moving at so much faster pace. We actually did run into them coming down to the South Summit, and I think that they probably did get a little jammed up. Maybe that first group of people, if we hadn't passed those guys, the ones who didn't want to break trail with us, we probably would have been back there, stuck with the crowds. So it was a great, decision to like move ahead and to go to the summit. But yeah, it was, as I said, it was really different. I think it wasn't like most other people.
Yeah. Is there anything at the very top? Do you write your name in a book or anything? Or did you take any of the snow or leave anything behind? Although you probably shouldn't leave anything behind.
No, I didn't take anything. And I know a lot of people go up with like flags and signs and such. I didn't. Like, I wasn't sponsored. Like, I was there on my own. And so, like, I didn't have any need to take any photos for anything, like special. Like I didn't, I'd never, again, I was just like a climber climbing a mountain. So I think this idea that like one day, like I'd be doing any kind of like press or publicity about it never crossed my mind. And so I certainly didn't take anything like that up. It's funny. I had to ask my company. It's funny. The company I was working for at the time, this was a company called United Technologies, and they had an advertising campaign. And I think it was, you can see everything from here was the tagline. And it was about innovation and technology and about being able to see everything, right? And so I had actually asked my company, because I was appreciative that I got the 3 months off work and that they were going to hold my job. So I'd asked them, I'd love to take a sign up, like a little, you can see everything from here, United Technologies sign up. And I got a note back from communications saying, no, you'd have to get all these approvals. You can't have it. And later on, of course, like the executives, like the vice presidents. So, but this was just like some communications manager who just completely denied it. And of course, like the vice presidents later on were like, wait, what? Like they were very disappointed. And I was like, well, that's what happens when you have bureaucracy that doesn't like I wasn't going to fight this woman who was telling me no. Like I was like, oh, I was just thinking it'd be nice as a thank you, but if you don't want me to, I honestly, like I was so focused on going back down that I almost didn't even take photos of myself. Panudu was like, no, you've got to take a photo, stop, photos.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think I was going to be like, oh, I'm here, cool, let's go, let's leave. Because I thought we were there by ourselves. I was very focused on getting off that mountain. So no, I mean, and certainly like I would never leave, never left anything on a mountain ever. I would never leave anything. Nor do I take things. I don't take things from mountains either. I think I just leave, like I take nothing. I leave nothing. I just
take the memories, take the memories.
Yeah, exactly.
Why do you think you were so much faster than the other people?
I'm not sure exactly. Panudu, I think, so part of it, I think Panudu, I should just talk about him a bit. The guiding company had this option that if you were there by yourself, so you weren't there like with a friend, it was supported but unguided, but so that you wouldn't be like completely by yourself on the mountain. If something went wrong, if you fell, if you're totally by yourself and that happened, like you could be very stuck, right? And in my case, it turned out I would have been, because I was really not near anybody for most of the time I was climbing. They gave you this option to hire what's called a personal Sherpa, and a personal Sherpa he's not sort of like shuttling your gear or anything like that. They tend to be more senior, more experienced. They've summited the mountain a bunch of times. They tend to be a little older. They speak they speak whatever language you speak. So, they're paired up in that way. They're just like a climbing partner who you've hired. So just a little humbling experience that there's people who are sort of like Everest summit climbing partners that you can just hire, and they just sort of go along with you on your big conquests. In case anyone really, for all the people who make a big deal out of this, I think there's nothing more humbling than that. But so that's what Panudu Sherpa's job was to be a personal Sherpa. But I am convinced that I absolutely got the best personal Sherpa. Like I got the best person that I could possibly. I can't imagine someone better. And I'm really like objectively, I think lots of people say things like that, but I think objectively he had done training at the Khumbu climbing schools. At that point, he was teaching other Sherpas some basic self-rescue skills. He had been to the summit many times. He was really experienced. Like, I just think I got very, very lucky that I was assigned just absolutely the best person. And even though his job wasn't to make decisions, certainly he had been on the mountain a bunch of times. And so he wasn't going to not advise, even though he wasn't necessarily being paid to do that. And he really was pressing the pace. Like, I think that this was really smart based on a lot of the things he said before it, that, a lot of times people are like slowly, 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 and that can be fine. And certainly you don't want to go faster than you're capable of, right? You don't want to get yourself in trouble because you push yourself too hard. But he had a sense at that point, we'd been together, of how fast I could move, and he knew I could move fast. So he was really pushing our pace. Like, when we were trying to make the decision to pass those other folks, I was like, I don't know, should we just stay behind him? And he was like, no, we should go. We should pass him. We should just go. So a lot of it was that. I think there are people who maybe would have been capable of moving faster and they just didn't. I think I did not get stuck behind somebody. Once you get higher up on the mountain, it gets harder and harder to pass. So the fact that we were keeping a really quick pace at the beginning and we passed everybody at the beginning, I think meant that we didn't get jammed up. I do think the style, I mentioned that we had that lighter oxygen tank. I do think that was really helping. At least, most days, if somebody from that company, from International Mountain Guys, was going, so on days where they had anybody from that group going to the summit, the IMG client was the first to the summit. So, and like, this happened many, many, many days where we were the first people to the summit by long distances, sometimes by hours, on some days. And so I do think that IMG's style, the way that they had set us up, we were actually more efficient and faster, going at a lower rate of oxygen use. I never actually switched my oxygen. I had that small tank. It's the only one I used. I never had to switch out of it. And then I don't know. And then, I just, whatever, as I said, I was a climber. I'd been climbing a lot at that point. I climbed, Ama Dablam 4, 5, 6 months before. I was really in good condition to climb because I'd been climbing so much the last few years. And again, I didn't even really train particularly for Everest. Like, I wasn't training for climbing. It was just my life. So like, that training that I did right before I left was like one last push, but I was in climbing shape for years, So, and again, I think that was also very typical of the IMG clients. So a lot of us were working from that baseline.
And even just with the training, the fact that you were just, you were in climbing condition. Do you do stuff like yoga or meditation to help sort of control your breathing so that maybe you weren't using as much oxygen as other people?
I did a lot of yoga before I started rock climbing. I was actually, in fact, when I lived in Tokyo, I would come back to the US on business trips and I would spend the weekends at yoga retreats because because the way my company reimbursed, I could stay there instead of staying at, some hotel in the city. And I do think that might have helped a bit. I do take a lot of oxygen though. I know this from when I learned to dive. Like, when I learned to dive, I actually I'd blow through my oxygen tanks because apparently I breathe very deeply. In fact, my first instructor had to tell me to breathe in more, she said, not to breathe so deeply, to breathe more shallow, which is not usually with everybody else. It's slow and deep when you're diving. And she's like, with you, breathe shallow because I think you're breathing too much. And her brother was a mountain climber. And so she had this sense that it had to do with that. So I think that I actually do, as I said, I think I actually do suck up a lot of oxygen, but we're moving fast. You're just not going to go through as much oxygen if you're just not on the mountain for as long. So that made a big difference. But just to give you a sense, there was another woman from IMG who went. So I left at 11 and got to the summit at 7. I think the next day, this woman Brenda left at the normal time. I think she left around 9. And she got to the summit like in the dark, and she was like back down. I don't even know what time it was, but I think she got it up because she was faster than I was. So I think she got to the summit at like 4 a.m. or something crazy like that, and was back down. Like it was, like as I said, we were all moving much, much more quickly than, and so she left at the regular time because it would never cross her mind to leave late. Like that would be weird. And that she was going to be so much faster than everybody else. But that's precisely what happened to her. She probably should have left 2 hours later so that she could have been on the summit after sunrise. So being fast was par for the course with that group.
Yeah. Are you still climbing now?
I am. I had I've been having back problems, which is not terribly surprising at my age. So I've been having back problems for the past few years. And so I've been very sort of in and out, mostly rock climbing when I moved to Seattle, and alpine mountaineering. I'd like to get back to Nepal, but I haven't, because I haven't been in Nepal now in 7 years. I think 2013 is the last time I was there, because I was planning on going back in 2017, which is when basically I had the back problems. So when my back problems started. So I'm now sort of over it. And I was actually thinking I was going to go back this year, but then there was a pandemic. So maybe next year.
For other women and girls out there who are thinking, you know what, I want to take on some big mountains, I want to get into mountaineering and climbing, what would your advice be to them?
Probably just try it. Like, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot that, I even say with people who ask about me being sort of the first Black woman to climb Everest, like, what was the difference? And I say, well, the difference is just that I did it. And other people just didn't. There's so many people who were perfectly capable of trying it, and they never tried. And a lot of times there were circumstances, right? I had a lot of privilege, a lot of circumstances that allowed me to try it. But even people who had all the circumstances just didn't. There's a quote, Amelia Earhart quote, that's something like, the most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is mere tenacity. So I think like just this decision to take the first step, and then just be really tenacious and really thoughtful, and do it for fun. I think jumping in and deciding you're going to, I guess there's some people who can jump in and decide they want to climb Everest. That's daunting to me. I think if I had done that, I would have never climbed Everest. I would have procrastinated to death. Whereas just the creep actually felt all very natural and not so overwhelming. So just take the first step and kind of keep progressing forward and see where it takes you.
Absolutely. And Sophia, are you on social media? Do you want to share that?
I have a very out-of-date website. I think it's danenberg.org, but my goodness, I have not updated it forever. My Instagram is Sophia Climbs. I am terrible about social media. I'm trying to get better, but certainly if I end up back in Nepal, there will be a lot on there because I don't have anywhere else to send these photos. Normally I just take these photos and I just keep them for myself. So usually when I'm traveling, that's when I have like this flurry of activity on social media. I don't when I'm at home. And so that's why I'm terrible about it, because I don't think to take photos. But when I go somewhere, then I'll take photos, and it'll certainly be there on Instagram.
Perfect. Amazing. Well, I'll make sure that I add your Instagram and your website handle to the show notes. But Sophia, thank you so much for being on Tough Girl podcast to share more about your love for the mountains and your passion for mountaineering. It has been absolutely inspiring to speak to you.
Thank you so much.
Hey tribe, I hope you enjoyed the episode with Sophia. So my name is Sarah Williams. I'm the host of the Tough Girl podcast and the founder of Tough Girl Challenges. Everything that we have talked about today will be in the show notes at toughgirlchallenges.com. So please do go and check it out. We've got new episodes coming out every Tuesday and Thursday. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. Just want to give you a heads up about a future episode that we have coming out. It's actually coming out in March, but we're going to be speaking to Gerlinde Kallenbrunner. She was the first woman to scale all 14 8,000 meter peaks without the use of supplementary oxygen. So that is an absolutely fascinating episode. So that's going to be coming out sometime in March. So yeah, make sure you keep listening. But I hope you are well, wherever you are, whatever you are doing, give it your all, give it 110%, get after it, go for it, make it happen. You're the only person who can take you closer to achieving your dreams and goals. Massive shout out to everybody who has been sharing the Tough Girl podcast on their social media channels by taking a snapshot of it when they're listening to Tough Girl podcast and tagging me in it on the Instagram stories, because what that allows me to do is to share it on my Instagram stories, because it's always more powerful when, obviously I shout from the rooftops about how amazing all the incredible women are that I speak to, but it's even better when other people share and then I can share them sharing their content. I think you get what I mean. So if you could take a screenshot wherever you are, whatever you are doing when you're listening to the Tough Girl podcast, tag me in it at Tough Girl Challenges, and then I'll share it on my Instagram stories as well, so more people can be inspired by these incredible women. But take care, lots of love, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.